A wealthy businessman, blinded by arrogance, never expected the hotel worker he looked down upon to uncover a secret that would change his life forever. A lost sibling he thought he'd never see again. Will family ties mend the wounds of the past, or will pride keep them apart? It was another ordinary day at the lavish Grand Royale Hotel. For Clara, a young woman in her late 20s, her job as a housekeeping staff was far from glamorous. She worked tirelessly, cleaning up after guests who often barely acknowledged her existence. Despite it all, Clara always wore a warm smile. Today, however, her usual optimism was tested when she entered the opulent penthouse suite to find a man yelling at one of her coworkers. The man, dressed in an expensive tailored suit, was tall, with piercing blue eyes and an air of arrogance that seemed to fill the room. His words cut like knives as he berated the staff for some trivial mistake involving a missing bottle of imported water. Clara stepped in, gently asking her coworker to leave. "I'll handle this," she said softly. Turning to the man, she took a deep breath. "Sir, I apologize for the inconvenience. I'll make sure your request is taken care of immediately." The man turned his sharp gaze to her. "You think an apology fixes everything? Do you even know who I am?" Clara didn't flinch. "I'm sorry, sir, but no matter who you are, there's no need to speak to anyone like that. Let me get your water and ensure everything meets your satisfaction." For a moment, he looked stunned. Nobody ever talked back to him, but he quickly masked his surprise with a sneer. "Typical," he muttered under his breath. "People like you wouldn't understand." Then he turned away dismissively. As Clara walked out of the room to fetch the water, her chest tightened. She wasn't sure why, but there was something painfully familiar about his voice. She shook her head, dismissing the thought as she hurried back to work. Days turned into weeks, and Clara continued to cross paths with the man, whose name she had learned was Ethan Cross. He was a wealthy businessman staying at the hotel while overseeing a high-profile merger. To Clara, he seemed like the embodiment of everything she'd grown up resenting: privilege without humility. Despite his cold demeanor, Clara couldn't help but observe him. He was always impeccably dressed, commanding attention wherever he went. Yet there were fleeting moments when he seemed almost human. A tired sigh after a phone call, a distant look in his eyes when he thought nobody was watching. Clara dismissed these moments as tricks of her imagination. A desperate attempt to find some redeeming quality in a man who clearly had none. One quiet afternoon, Clara was tasked with organizing the storage room, a dusty, forgotten space tucked away in the hotel's basement. As she sorted through a pile of old books and papers, she found an item that didn't seem to belong: an old, slightly crumpled photograph. Curious, she picked it up and brushed off the dust. Her heart stopped. The image was faded, but the faces were unmistakable. It was a picture of two children. A little boy with piercing blue eyes, and a little girl with curly hair and a bright smile. They were standing in front of a house that looked eerily familiar. Clara stared at the boy's face, her mind racing. Those eyes, so sharp and distinct, matched Ethan's perfectly. Her breath caught as memories began to surface, long-buried fragments of a childhood she had tried so hard to forget. The boy in the photo wasn't just any child, he was her brother. The realization hit her like a tidal wave, leaving her knees weak. She clutched the photograph, her hands trembling as she sank to the floor. Flashes of their shared childhood came rushing back. Laughter in the backyard, whispered secrets under the covers, the way he'd always protect her when their parents argued. Tears welled up in her eyes as she pieced it all together. Ethan Cross, the arrogant businessman who seemed to look down on everyone, was the same boy who had once been her best friend, her confidant, her brother. The brother she had lost so many years ago. But how could it be? How had life taken them on such different paths, turning them into strangers? And most importantly, what was she supposed to do now? Clara's mind raced as she pieced together fragments of her childhood, memories that had been buried under years of hardship and longing. She closed her eyes, letting the images come into focus. She could see her mother's tired smile as she tucked Clara into bed, hear her father's booming laughter before the arguments began, and feel the small, protective hand of her brother in hers as they huddled together in their shared room. Her family had been torn apart when she was only 5 years old. The shouting, The slamming doors, the tearful goodbyes, it all came rushing back. Their parents' marriage had crumbled after years of fighting. When the divorce finally happened, it was like a storm ripping through their lives. Her mother had taken her, leaving behind the house, the memories, and most painfully, Ethan. She remembered crying in the backseat of the car as they drove away, her small voice pleading with her mother to go back for her brother. But her mother's face was set in stone, her own pain hidden behind a mask of determination. Clara had asked about Ethan every day for months, but eventually, the questions stopped. There were no answers that could soothe the ache of his absence. Years later, when her mother passed away, Clara's life took another cruel turn. She found herself thrust into the foster care system, bouncing from one home to another. Each new place brought its own challenges, but the longing for her brother remained constant. She clung to the few memories she had of him, the way he'd call her squirt and make silly faces to cheer her up. When she turned 18, Clara had tried to find Ethan. She scoured old documents, made phone calls, and even visited their old neighborhood. But it was as if he had vanished. The search drained her emotionally and financially, and eventually she had to accept the heartbreaking truth. They were lost to each other. And now, after all these years, he was here, standing mere feet away from her, completely unaware of who she was. The realization was almost too much to bear. Clara felt a lump form in her throat as she watched him from across the room, his confident stride and sharp features so different from the boy she remembered. Yet, those piercing blue eyes were the same, and they looked right past her, unrecognizing. Her heart ached with a mix of joy and sorrow. Joy that he was alive, that he had made something of himself. Sorrow that he seemed so far removed from the brother she had loved, the boy who had once been her world. Clara clutched the photograph tightly, as if it could anchor her in the storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. What was she supposed to do now? Should she approach him, reveal the truth? Or should she keep her distance, content to know that he was safe and thriving? The questions swirled in her mind, each one more daunting than the last. Clara's breath hitched as she realized that no matter what she decided, nothing would ever be the same again. Clara couldn't hold back any longer. The next time she saw Ethan, he was in the hotel lobby, engrossed in a phone call. Summoning all her courage, she approached him, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure he could hear it. "Mr. Cross," she began, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. He glanced at her, his expression a mix of irritation and impatience. "What is it now?" he snapped, clearly annoyed at the interruption. Clara's hands tightened into fists at her sides, but she kept her composure. "I need to talk to you. It's important." Ethan sighed, rolling his eyes as he ended his call. "Fine," he said, his tone sharp. "You have 2 minutes." For a moment, Clara hesitated. The weight of what she was about to reveal felt almost unbearable. But then, with trembling fingers, she pulled out the photograph. "Do you recognize this?" Ethan's brow furrowed as he took the picture from her. His initial confusion quickly turned to disbelief. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice quieter now, tinged with something she couldn't quite place. "I found it here in the hotel," Clara said, her voice breaking slightly. "Ethan, it's me. Clara, your sister." The color seemed to drain from Ethan's face. He stared at her, then back at the photograph, his usually confident demeanor unraveling. That's impossible," he stammered. "Clara, she..." He trailed off, shaking his head as if trying to dispel the thought. "She's gone. I looked for her." "I looked for you too," Clara interrupted, tears streaming down her face. "But I didn't know where to start. I thought I'd never find you." Ethan's expression softened, his icy exterior cracking to reveal a vulnerability that Clara hadn't thought possible. "Clara?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "Is it really you?" She nodded, her own emotions threatening to overwhelm her. And then, for the first time, Ethan's arrogance melted away completely. He stepped forward and pulled her into a hug, his arms wrapping tightly around her as if afraid she might disappear again. I can't believe this," he said, his voice breaking. "After all these years, Clara, I'm so sorry." Clara clung to him, the years of pain and separation dissolving in that moment. "I missed you so much," she sobbed. "I thought I'd lost you forever." Ethan pulled back just enough to look at her, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You didn't lose me," he said softly. "We found each other. And I'm never letting you go again." The reunion was bittersweet. Ethan apologized profusely for his behavior, admitting that he'd let his success turn him into someone he barely recognized. Clara, ever forgiving, reminded him that they now had a chance to rebuild what was lost. They spent hours catching up, sharing stories of their lives apart. Ethan was stunned by Clara's resilience, while Clara saw glimpses of the brother she remembered beneath his hardened exterior. In the days that followed, Ethan made it a point to show kindness to the hotel staff, inspired by Clara's humility and strength. More importantly, he and Clara began to forge a new bond, vowing never to lose each other again. For Clara, it wasn't just about finding her brother. It was about finding a piece of herself she thought she'd lost forever. And for Ethan, it was a chance to become a better man, guided by the sister he never stopped loving. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more emotional and dramatic tales like this, please make sure to hit that like button. It really helps us out. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What part of this story touched you the most? And if you know someone who would enjoy this, feel free to share it with them. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us keep bringing you more amazing content. Thank you, and see you in the next story.